Great Britain has a long history at the intersection between church and state. Much of Britain's legislation has been entirely founded on religious principles. To get a sense of just how deep this tie goes, let's take a look at some key pieces of legislation in the history of Great Britain. First, we must discuss one major tie between church and state.
Marriage.
Before the 1753 Marriage Act, there were very few restrictions on marriage. The only requirements were free consent of both partners, 14 for boys and 12 for girls, which could result in some very young marriages. The partners could not have an unlawful degree of kinship, as in they could not be close family members, cousins, sisters, brothers, things of that sort, and they could not be engaged to any other marriage. This means that things we think of as necessary for a legal marriage today were not necessary. For example, parents and witnesses were not required to consent or be present. A marriage could be sealed by both parties agreeing at the time or agreed for the future, and then follow the verbal agreement with sexual intercourse or consummation. With no witnesses needed, a marriage could be as easily documented as someone writing a letter and calling a person their husband or wife. A marriage could be considered legally binding just because two partners cohabitate under the same roof. Under these restrictions, Romeo and Juliet, had it been set in Britain, would have been a really short play. This became a problem when a man named John Campbell died. John Campbell was publicly married to Jean Campbell, but shortly after his death, a lady named Magdalena Cochrane filed for his pension. She stated that she had evidence that she was Campbell's wife first, and that his marriage to Jean was invalid.
I affirm and can prove
Proceed.
that Edward Fairfax Rochester was 15 years ago married to my sister, Bertha Antoinetta Mason, at St. James's Church, Spanish Town, Jamaica.
Magdalena did not have a written marriage document. The only thing she had were letters admitting to the marriage. She stated that she was asked by Campbell to keep their marriage a secret.
Please, just promise you won't tell.
All right.
This case made it clear that something needed to change. The 1753 Marriage Act was introduced to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. The act was the first statutory legislation in England and Wales requiring formal ceremony of marriage in a church or public chapel. It applied to every person in England aside from the royal family, Quakers, and Jews. The minimum age required remained the same, for women 12, men 14, but parental consent was required for everyone under the age of 21.
This is ridiculous. Violet's only 14. She can't be legally married.
She can if she has the permission of her guardian. And who's that? Oh, yes, me!
In 1836, another piece of legislation regarding who and how people could marry was passed. The creatively named 1836 Marriage Act allowed marriages to be legally registered in buildings belonging to other religious groups. It removed some restrictions. It established that notice of every marriage in England shall be given in writing, signed by one of the parties, to the registrar of the district within which the marriage was intended to be solemnized. It also stated that no marriage should be solemnized after the expiration of 21 days from the provision of such notice. In other words, the wedding must take place within 21 days of filing the paperwork, or the marriage will be null and void. It placed a duty on the registrar to file the marriage book, which would update the registrar books of births, deaths, and marriages. It guaranteed the right to marry at any time and place, not necessarily with the rights of the Church of England, removing restrictions on Roman Catholics and other groups. The place only needed to file the proper paperwork with the Registrar General. Weddings could now be conducted in any registered place of worship in the presence of two witnesses and the local registrar. As time went on, legislation became more religiously tolerant, as exemplified in the 1846 Religious Disabilities Act. This act was created to relieve Her Majesty's subjects from certain penalties and disabilities in regard to religious opinions. Basically, it allowed citizens professing the Jewish religion to be subject to the same laws as Protestants when it came to schools, places of worship, education, charities, and properties. This marks the beginning of religious tolerance and freedom within the British Empire. The passage of the Religious Disabilities Act did not solve for all problems for those of other faiths. Thus entered the 1858 Jewish Disabilities Act. It took Baron Lionel Nathan de Rothschild 11 years to get his seat in the British Parliament. Rothschild was Jewish and would not take the Christian oath required of the Parliament. The Whig leader, Lord John Russell, introduced the Jewish Disabilities Act, aka the 1858 Jewish Relief Act, following Rothschild's election. Although it was turned down a number of times, the House of Lords finally decided to allow each house to decide its own oath. Rothschild then became the first unconverted Jew to take seat in the British Parliament, exchanging the forbidden words in the loyalty oath with the phrase, "So help me, Jehovah." After becoming more religiously tolerant, England began to move in a secular direction with the 1888 Oaths Act. The 1888 Oaths Act was an act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom which allowed that an oath of allegiance could be affirmed rather than sworn to God. Affirming something is an act that takes religion out of the process and is equal by law. For example, a witness can state, "I affirm that I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in court," rather than placing a hand on the Bible and stating, "I swear to tell the truth," and so on. The act was pushed by popular secularist and atheist Charles Bradlaugh, who was using this to campaign for a seat in office. This was an important piece of secularist legislation and was later repealed by the Oaths Act of 1978. It is clear that many, if not all, of Great Britain's laws before 1800 were based around an entirely religious agenda. Even legislation not seemingly about religion was influenced by Christian ideals. The inverse of this can be seen in the later part of the century as the country began to acknowledge and reverse its Christian influences. In attempting to secularize certain legal proceedings and create laws more tolerant of other religions, England began to drive a wedge between church and state. Even during this push, it can still be seen how religion continued to influence British legislation. Places of worship still needed to register in order to conduct weddings, and it took a specific act by Queen Victoria to alleviate the burdens placed on religions outside of the Church of England. Beginning with the 1753 Marriage Act, you can see how each of the subsequent pieces of legislation were needed to protect individuals and begin the process of religious tolerance and freedom.